There are ancient writings tied to the Garden of Eden that most people have never heard of, not because they were meaningless, not because they were forgotten by accident, but because they sat too close to the beginning, too close to questions humanity has never stopped asking. Long before Eden became a brief story summarized in a few verses, these writings lingered in the background of early faith. They were read slowly, copied carefully, discussed in quiet gatherings where people believed that Genesis was not the whole conversation, but the doorway into something deeper. They spoke of Eden not merely as a garden, but as a world, not merely as a moment, but as a season, a place where humanity learned, questioned, hesitated, and chose. And for a time, these writings were not considered dangerous. They were treated as reflections, attempts to understand what happened when humanity first stood at the edge of knowledge and consequence. But as generations passed, something shifted. The questions these texts raised grew heavier, their implications more unsettling. Because if Eden was more than innocence, if humanity's first days involved awareness, instruction, and responsibility, then the story we thought we understood may not be as simple as we were taught. Early leaders noticed this tension. Some believed these writings illuminated Genesis. Others feared they complicated it. Debates began, not in public sermons, but in councils, letters, and quiet disagreements that never made it into official doctrine. And slowly, without a single dramatic moment, these books were set aside. Not burned, not erased, just excluded. What did they say about life in Eden that Genesis only hints at? Why did respected teachers argue over them? And why did consensus never come? And how do these texts reshape the way we understand humanity's very first steps, before exile, before history, before the world we recognize? These are not questions we'll answer yet, because near the end of this video, I'll share the single idea found in these lost writings, an idea so unsettling that it changed how early believers thought about innocence, responsibility, and the human condition itself. And once you hear it, you'll understand why the lost books of Eden were never truly forgotten, only quietly left behind. In this video, I am not asking you to abandon what you know. I am inviting you to look closer. What you are about to hear does not come from imagination or modern speculation. It comes from fragments preserved in manuscripts, from writings referenced by early teachers, from traditions that survived not because they were approved, but because they were copied by hands that believed truth was worth preserving, even when it was uncomfortable. We will trace where the lost books of Eden came from, not as myths drifting in isolation, but as texts born within the same spiritual world that gave us Genesis itself. You will discover what these writings claim happened before the fall, before exile, before shame, before the gates of Eden closed. Moments the canonical text passes over in silence, yet moments that ancient readers felt compelled to remember. You will also see what they describe after the fall, not merely punishment and departure, but sorrow, instruction, regret, and a lingering connection between humanity and what was lost. And slowly, carefully, we will examine why these writings resurfaced again and again across centuries, why monks preserved them in remote places, why scholars debated them instead of dismissing them, why questions about Eden never truly faded, even when the texts themselves were no longer read aloud. This is not a journey meant to rush. It is meant to unfold, like dawn breaking over something ancient and half-forgotten. If you stay with me until the end, you will understand why these writings were never truly forgotten. They were not erased because they were false. They were set aside because they were heavy, because they asked humanity to carry responsibility earlier than we were comfortable admitting. And by the time we reach the final revelation, you will see that the story of Eden has always been larger than we were taught. Not rewritten, not replaced, but quietly waiting for someone willing to listen with reverence. To understand why the lost books of Eden matter, we must step back into a world very different from our own. A world without printed Bibles, without chapters and verse numbers. A world where scripture was not something passively read, but something wrestled with, lingered over, and carried in the memory. We return to a time stretching roughly from the 1st century before Christ to the early centuries after. A fragile span of history where faith communities were forming their identity, where questions were not seen as threats, and where Genesis was not yet sealed behind final interpretation. In these communities, both Jewish and early Christian, Genesis was read aloud slowly. Its words echoed in synagogues, in homes, in desert dwellings where scribes bent over parchment by lamplight. And as they listened, many sensed something quietly unresolved. The opening chapters felt compressed, not incomplete, but dense, like a story told in haste about events that deserved stillness. They noticed how quickly Eden moved from creation to command, from innocence to exile, how entire worlds seemed to pass in a handful of verses. And so they did what humans have always done when faced with sacred mystery. They reflected. They expanded. They preserved what they believed had been handed down alongside the text itself. These were not rebels. They were caretakers. The lost books of Eden were not written in isolation. They emerged from within the same spiritual soil that nurtured Scripture. They were shaped by teachers who believed that understanding God's earliest dealings with humanity required patience, imagination disciplined by reverence, and humility before mystery. Scribes copied these writings by hand, each letter deliberate, each line an act of devotion. There was no guarantee the work would survive. Ink faded, scrolls tore, fires erased entire libraries. Yet these texts endured, passed quietly from teacher to student, from community to community. They circulated through oral tradition as well, stories told in fragments, teachings whispered rather than proclaimed. Not because they were forbidden, but because they were considered weighty. Not everyone was ready to hear them. At first, these writings were treated as thoughtful reflections on Genesis. They sat alongside other interpretive works, offering texture where Scripture was brief, silence where Scripture moved on. They helped early believers imagine Eden not as a frozen moment in the past, but as a living beginning, one that shaped everything that followed. But slowly, something changed. As communities grew and doctrines hardened, the implications of these texts became clearer. Their questions pressed deeper. Their portrayals of Eden suggested that humanity's first days involved learning, awareness, and responsibility earlier than many were comfortable admitting. And with clarity came discomfort. Leaders began to ask whether these expansions helped faith or unsettled it, whether they clarified God's design or complicated it. Some believed the texts illuminated truth. Others feared they blurred essential lines. So debates arose. Not loud debates, quiet ones. The kind that happen in letters, councils, margins of manuscripts. The kind that leave no dramatic record, only outcomes. And gradually, without condemnation, without spectacle, these writings were no longer read publicly. They were not destroyed. They were simply left behind. If understanding Scripture beyond the surface matters to you, subscribing is how these deeper explorations continue. Because most people never stop to ask what might be missing. They simply accept what they were given, and never wonder what was once held, questioned, and quietly set aside. According to these lost writings, Eden was not merely a garden. It was a place of instruction. Not a classroom in the way we imagine one, but a sacred environment where learning unfolded slowly, where existence itself taught. The air carried meaning. The rhythm of creation instructed without words. Time was not rushed. Nothing was wasted. In these texts, Eden breathes. Adam and Eve do not awaken into a world they immediately misunderstand. They are not portrayed as fragile, empty beings wandering blindly through beauty. Instead, they are formed with capacity to listen, to observe, to receive. Knowledge comes to them gradually. They learn the order of creation. They learn the boundaries that preserve life. They learn that freedom is real, but never weightless. The lost writings speak of instruction given before prohibition, of understanding that grows before testing. Eden, in this telling, is not innocence without awareness, but innocence being shaped by awareness. Adam and Eve are taught about the world they are placed within, about the harmony that sustains it, about consequence, not as threat, but as truth. Actions echo, choices matter, even in paradise. And this is where the story slows down. Because unlike Genesis, where the narrative moves swiftly from command to transgression, these texts linger. They pause. They dwell in moments that Scripture compresses into silence. They describe extended conversations, not arguments, but explanations, not confusion, but clarity patiently offered. There are moments of hesitation described, moments where choice hangs quietly in the air, unresolved. Warnings are given, not as ultimatums, but as guidance meant to preserve what is good. In these accounts, the fall is not sudden. It is approached, step by step, thought by thought, choice by choice. This does not make the story darker. It makes it heavier, because a fall preceded by instruction carries a different weight than a fall born of ignorance. These writings expand Genesis' brief narrative into fuller scenes. They give emotional contour to what the canonical text leaves spare, not to contradict it, but to sit beneath it, like a deeper current beneath the surface of still water. And woven through these expansions are echoes of wisdom literature, ideas that later appear in Proverbs, in reflective teachings about knowledge, responsibility, and the cost of discernment. Themes that suggest humanity was always meant to grow, to learn, to choose, not to remain untouched by understanding. But this is where things begin to shift. Because once Eden becomes a place of learning, innocence can no longer mean ignorance. Once Adam and Eve are shown receiving knowledge over time, responsibility enters the story earlier than expected. Once warnings are remembered, the fall becomes not merely tragic, but deliberate. And that realization unsettled those who read these texts closely, because it forces a question few were ready to answer. What does it mean to fall, if you were already being taught how to stand? This is the moment where the lost books of Eden stop feeling like gentle reflections and begin to feel dangerous. Not because they accuse humanity, but because they refuse to simplify it. And from here, the story does not retreat. It deepens. Now we begin to glimpse why these texts caused unease among early readers. They did not deny Genesis. They did not contradict it openly, but they expanded it, revealing layers that had been compressed into silence. Where Genesis moves swiftly, these writings pause. Where Genesis hints, these texts elaborate. And in doing so, they raise questions that few were ready to confront. They speak in language dense with symbolism. Every tree, every river, every gesture carries meaning beyond the literal. They are not simple stories, but intricate lessons disguised as narrative. And without careful guidance, the weight of that symbolism could be misunderstood, misapplied, or even feared. These writings explore how much knowledge humanity possessed before the fall, not merely curiosity, but understanding of consequence, responsibility, and the fragile balance between obedience and freedom. They suggest that Adam and Eve were not ignorant. They were aware, capable of discernment, taught, and yet still tested. This interpretive expansion unsettled some. It challenged what was considered safe to teach. It asked readers to consider human choice in ways that could shake complacency. And in that tension, early leaders felt the weight of responsibility. Now we can begin to see why these texts raised concern. They were reverent, profound, sacred, but they were heavy. Not everyone agreed that this weight was appropriate for the wider community. Some feared that exposing ordinary believers to these reflections might distort the simplicity of Genesis. Others embraced them quietly, preserving their insights in manuscripts and memory, hoping that the time would come when readers were ready. And yet, this still was not the real reason they were set aside. There was something deeper, more profound, an implication that touched the very understanding of humanity's beginning and the way choice, knowledge, and responsibility intertwine. At this moment, pause and consider your own journey. If you are still watching, it means you care about understanding the Bible deeply, not just hearing familiar verses repeated, but wrestling with what has been hidden, overlooked, or quietly preserved. Subscribing does more than support a channel. It affirms that careful exploration, reverent inquiry, and the pursuit of truth still matter. It tells platforms and the world that thoughtful biblical history deserves attention, reflection, and respect. And now, with this intention set, we continue further into the story, closer to the truths that have remained largely unseen, yet quietly shaping understanding for millennia. The real issue was never simple contradiction. These writings did not seek to overthrow Scripture. They were careful, reverent, faithful in their own right. Yet they carried implications, subtle, profound, unavoidable, that unsettled those charged with safeguarding the faith. If Adam and Eve possessed deeper understanding before the fall, then the very nature of responsibility shifted. Sin was no longer merely the result of ignorance. It became a conscious, deliberate choice, weighed against instruction, guidance, and awareness. What had once been a story of innocence became a story of accountability, of moral weight laid upon humanity from its very beginning. And this was frightening, because teaching that all humans were innocent until error is easier to hold, easier to govern, easier to simplify. But teaching that humans were taught, guided, and yet still fell, that raised questions no leader could answer comfortably. What does it mean to bear the weight of knowledge? How do you measure accountability when awareness precedes action? And if early humans were not naive, what does that say about the human condition today? Leaders feared these ideas could confuse. They feared they could undermine the simplicity of Genesis. They feared that ordinary believers, unprepared for the subtlety and depth of instruction woven into Eden, might misunderstand, misapply, or even reject essential truths. And so, slowly, quietly, the community began to decide, not by edict or fire, but by omission, by restraint, by consensus that could never quite be reached. Some argued for inclusion, others resisted, and in the absence of agreement, the choice was made, not to destroy, but to set aside. The books survived in fragments, in whispers, in the hands of those who revered them enough to preserve them clandestinely. But they would not shape the canon. They were kept, yet removed, preserved, yet silent, treasured, yet hidden. And in that quiet removal lies the truth of their weight. It was never merely about what they said. It was about what they implied, what they suggested about humanity's first steps, about knowledge and choice, about the gravity of awareness in the Garden of Beginnings. It was not rejection for error, but rejection for revelation too potent, too challenging for the time. The texts remained, but their voice was muted in public reading, waiting patiently for those who would listen with care, reverence, and a readiness to hold the truth without fear. And now, with that understanding, we can begin to feel the weight of what was almost lost, and why those who preserved it did so with solemn devotion, a devotion that speaks across centuries, even into this very moment. If we take these texts seriously, if we allow ourselves to enter the world they preserve, Eden is no longer a place of simple innocence. It becomes the beginning of human responsibility. The garden, once imagined as a safe, untouched cradle of life, is revealed instead as a classroom of consequence. Every step, every glance, every choice carries weight. The decisions of Adam and Eve are no longer minor preludes. They are the first human decisions, laden with understanding, foresight, and moral gravity. Humanity's story begins not with ignorance, but with choice. Not with naivety, but with the heavy, sacred capacity to know, to discern, and to act. In this telling, we are not stumbling into sin unprepared. We are standing at the threshold of knowledge, and our actions are deliberate. Our failures, our triumphs, our very fallibility, are all recognized as the unfolding of a moral awakening. These texts do not shy away from the weight of awareness. They portray Eden as a place where free will is real, not abstract, not theoretical, but experienced in every interaction, every temptation, every conversation. Adam and Eve are guided, instructed, warned, yet left to exercise choice. Their freedom is complete and terrifying in its responsibility. And from this lens, morality is no longer a set of imposed rules. It is a lived reality. Awareness carries consequence. Knowledge carries responsibility. Humanity emerges into history not as blank slates, but as beings entrusted with understanding, capable of both wisdom and error. Few who glanced at these writings could grasp the full depth of this truth. It is easy to see Genesis as a story of innocence lost. It is much harder to confront Eden as a place where innocence was never absent, but where humanity was trained in the weight of awareness, long before exile or punishment. These writings change the way we understand humanity's first days. They remind us that choice, knowledge, and responsibility are inseparable from the very beginning. They ask us, across the centuries, to consider that the burden of understanding is not a modern burden, but an ancient one, born first by the first humans and quietly preserved in the texts that dared to tell it. In these pages, we find the subtle truth. Humanity was never truly naive. We were instructed. We were warned. We were given freedom, and with it, the sacred weight of consequence. And so Eden is no longer merely a garden lost to time. It is the cradle of responsibility, the first classroom where the moral soul of humanity was shaped. It is where awareness dawned, choice began, and the story of consequence, our story, truly unfolded. Today, in a world that moves quickly, we struggle with questions that are ancient, yet ever new. Responsibility, choice, consequence. Decisions ripple outward, touching lives we may never fully see. And in the quiet moments, when we pause to reflect, these questions press upon us, heavy and unavoidable, much as they pressed upon the earliest humans in Eden. It is here that the lost books of Eden speak again. Their voice, preserved across centuries, whispers to those willing to listen. They remind us that humanity's first steps were not blind. That choice carried weight from the very beginning. That awareness and consequence are inseparable companions. The reason these texts matter today is not merely historical. It is profoundly personal. They illuminate the path of understanding we walk even now. They reveal that moral clarity is rarely simple. That knowledge comes with responsibility. That the lessons of our beginnings continue to shape our endings. These writings do not remove mystery. They do not simplify. They do not make the sacred easily digestible. But they deepen it. They invite us to dwell and wonder, to ponder with reverence, to engage with questions that have never lost their power to shape the human soul. And now, as we pause to reflect on all that has been revealed, consider this. If you have learned something tonight, if the faint echo of Eden has stirred your mind, do not let this be the end. There are countless other texts, preserved in shadow, quietly awaiting discovery. Forgotten writings that hold fragments of truth, pieces of instruction, moments of sacred revelation. If those who care do not seek them, engage with them, and carry their lessons forward, they fade once more into silence. The voices of the past, entrusted to careful hands, risk being lost again. Subscribing is more than a simple gesture. It is a vow to remember, a vow to listen, a vow to ensure that these ancient truths, these lost books, these sacred reflections continue to speak, to awaken, to illuminate, and to guide. By choosing to stay, to engage, to subscribe, you are saying, I will not let this knowledge vanish. I will carry it forward. And in doing so, you join a lineage of seekers who have, across centuries, quietly held the weight of Eden in their hands and preserved its lessons for those ready to hear. Some view the lost books of Eden as symbolic reflections, beautiful attempts to give shape to mystery, to imagine what Genesis leaves unspoken. They are seen as meditations, contemplative expansions, artistic interpretations of the divine narrative. In this light, their value lies not in literal truth, but in the depth of thought they provoke, in the way they invite reflection on life, choice, and consequence. Others see them as preserved tradition, fragments of knowledge passed carefully from hand to hand, from teacher to student, across generations. Not allegory, but witness. Evidence that early readers and scribes believed these accounts contained something essential, something worth remembering even when wider consensus could not embrace them. What is undeniable is not whether they are symbolic or literal, but the influence they carry. Even in their quiet absence from the canon, they have shaped thought, inspired interpretation, and whispered questions that linger. What does it truly mean to begin life with awareness? What weight does knowledge carry when innocence coexists with instruction? How early does responsibility settle upon the human soul? These questions reach beyond Eden. They touch every human story that follows. Every choice we make, every understanding we gain, every moment when knowledge illuminates the path before us. They all echo the lessons hinted at in these lost books. And so we are left with a quiet reverence, a sense that what has been preserved, even in fragments, matters more than we often realize. The lost books of Eden are not merely texts to be read. They are invitations. Invitations to consider the depth of human beginnings, the gravity of choice, and the sacred responsibility that has accompanied us from the first steps in the garden to this very moment. They remind us that the story of humanity is never simple. It is layered, nuanced, profound. And to engage with it is to participate in a long lineage of reflection, of seeking, of careful listening to voices that, though often hidden, continue to speak across the centuries. And now, as we reach the close of this journey through the lost books of Eden, pause for a moment. Let the weight of what has been revealed settle gently upon your mind, like the soft hush of twilight over a hidden garden. The teachings, the warnings, the moments of hesitation and instruction, they linger still, even after the reading ends. They do not vanish. They echo quietly, inviting reflection, inviting reverence, inviting you to carry them forward. But the story does not end here. Eden, as we have seen, is only the beginning. Beyond the garden, beyond the fall, Beyond the first lessons in responsibility and awareness, there are texts that extend the story even further. Texts that push boundaries, that confront the unseen, that challenge understanding in ways both awe-inspiring and disquieting. In the next video, we will turn to another ancient writing, one that connects directly to humanity's earliest days. A text that walks where Eden leaves off, and that delves into realms few have dared to examine. Realms where the divine and the mortal, the earthly and the heavenly, intersect in ways that nearly reshaped understanding of the angels themselves. It is a story that asks even more of us. A story that requires patience, discernment, and reverence. It begins where Eden ends, tracing the delicate threads of knowledge, warning, and choice into realms that were once considered untouchable. As you prepare to follow that journey, remember this: the lost books of Eden were preserved because someone, somewhere, believed they mattered. They believed that the questions they raised, the truths they hinted at, the understanding they carried, deserved to survive the quiet passage of time. And now, in this moment, that responsibility passes to you. The garden may be behind us, yet its lessons remain alive. Its echoes call us to listen, to reflect, to recognize that our story, our humanity, was shaped not by ignorance, but by choice, instruction, and awakening from the very beginning. And so we wait together for the next revelation, for the next text, for the next quiet unveiling of truths that history almost forgot, but that, if we are willing, we can now hold in our hands, in our minds, in our reverent reflection. Eden ends here, but the story continues, and it is more profound than most have imagined.